to everyone here in the building. Hello to everybody joining online. My name is Luke, and I love baptisms. I love baptisms. I love them because at a baptism, you are allowed to do something that you're not allowed to do anywhere else, in polite company at least. At baptism, you are allowed to do something that is just not the done thing. You are allowed to get wet while you've still got your clothes on. How fun is that? Spontaneous water fights, not really the done thing. Taking a shower after you've got dressed, not the done thing. Waking up your spouse in their PJs with a pail of water, not the done thing. But getting dressed up in your Sunday best and then letting someone pour water over your head or even dunk you into a pool on occasion, the done thing. Wow, that's why I love baptisms. They're odd. They're the one point in life when you are allowed, in a formal setting, to get soaked with your clothes on. And I really love the power in that moment. The jolt, the shock, when the water hits and it's like being shaken and woken up out of an old, steady, neat, acceptable life and waking up into a way more extravagant and free and messy and alive kind of life. A new life. That's what's just happened for Iona. And I know she's only little and life is pretty new and pretty exciting already for her. But this morning, she's been splashed and shaken awake into an even newer life. A new life of close friendship with the most extravagant, free, messy, alive person there is. Jesus. And something similar happened to Peter. Peter got wet with his clothes on and had his life changed by Jesus too. Peter was a fisherman from Lake Galilee, and he had followed Jesus for about 3 years. He had high hopes for Jesus. He thought Jesus was the Christ, the one who would deliver the Jewish people from Roman oppression. But unfortunately, he didn't. Instead, Jesus got himself killed on a cross by the Romans. And now here we are with Peter and some of Jesus' other followers who have apparently just gone back to their old pre-Jesus life of fishing on Lake Galilee. I'm going out to fish, Peter says, in defeat. We'll come with you, say the others, equally defeated. It's like there's nothing else to do, no bigger hope, no bigger picture in life. Jesus is dead, but we're still here, so back to the grindstone, I guess. Got to make a living. I'm going out to fish. But then something impossible happens. Jesus turns up on the shore of the lake. Remember I said that Jesus is extravagant and free and messy and alive. The most extravagant, free, messy, alive person there is. Well, the scene that follows is classic Jesus in that regard. It's a scene of absolute overload, sensory overload, fish overload, and forgiveness overload. Why don't we just go through some of the sheer sensory stuff of this scene? It's a silent dawn, and morning light begins to break over the horizon onto the lake, gloomily lighting up a little fishing boat which is near the shore, and the bodies of 7 or so fishermen on the boat. And the fishermen are naked. Yes, they're naked. It seems like these fishermen were naked. Look again at verse 7 if you've got your Bibles there. In this translation it says, Peter put his garment on, brackets, for he had taken it off. But literally, what the original Greek says is, brackets, for he was naked. There's no sidestepping this. I know we're in church, but Peter was naked. And apparently that was okay with Galilee fishermen in those days. So, naked men on a boat, sunrise breaking over the hills, silence. Then the silence of the lake is broken by a voice which barks, "Boys!" Again, our translation changes it a bit. In verse 5, in our translation, the voice says, "Friends." But the Greek word is actually children, kids. "Boys, haven't you caught any fish?" "No," they shout back. "Throw your net onto the other side of the boat," says the voice, "and you will find some." They do this, and then fish overload. Fish overload. A huge number of fish flood into their net, and the fishermen, their bodies and senses shocked into action after a very quiet night, haul up on the net as best they can, trying to stop the net sinking the boat. I've got a slide, if you could put that up, showing 3 of the 19 or so fish species that dwelt in this lake in Jesus' day. These are 3 of the largest ones, the ones that would have been slapping about in that net, eyeballing the disciples on that dawn. And the net would have been very heavy. Now, oddly enough, I was hauling fish myself just last Sunday. I really was. My father-in-law is a keen trout fisherman, and last Sunday I had the day off, and I was tasked with moving a backlog of his frozen trout from their freezer in the garden shed to the freezer in the house. There must have been about 50 fish, well, probably fewer than 50 fish, but I can attest from my experience last week that fish are heavy. I had to use this huge wheelbarrow, and it was called the Henchman on the product label on the wheelbarrow. I had to use the Henchman to move these fish. Now, 153 large fish is a massive weight. Let's get those fish up again. If it were, for example, the one at the top, it's called blue tilapia. I've actually eaten one of them at Lake Galilee. It was quite tasty. 153 blue tilapia would come to about the weight of a grand piano. 350, 400 kilograms. A grand piano. Or a little less than the weight of 7 men. So, these 7 fishermen would have been desperately trying to balance the weight of a grand piano with the weight of their own bodies on this little boat, trying to stop the boat from capsizing. And while they do this, for one of the fishermen, something suddenly clicks. Perhaps it's the overload of the situation that hits him, the ridiculousness, the extravagance, the messiness. It suddenly clicks. Hang on a minute. It's the Lord. It's Jesus. It's him. When Peter hears his friend say this, he lets go of the net. The boat must have lurched, and then Peter's baptism moment takes place. It's Peter's moment to get wet with his clothes on and start a new life with Jesus. So he puts on his clothes and dives into the lake, splash, and then paddles to the beach. And I just want to draw your attention to one more bit of sensory overload here. When Peter comes out of the water, before he can even rub his eyes to see Jesus, there is a smell. A smell. The smell of a charcoal fire. The risen Jesus has built and lit a charcoal fire to cook some fish. It's a barbecue, and the smoke is being carried in the breeze. You know, sometimes a particular smell or sound or taste just overloads you. It bears so much weight that it suddenly drags you back to somewhere else. Perhaps to a barely remembered childhood place, perhaps to a recent event. And for a split second, that smell or that sound or that taste, it's as if you're completely in that remembered place. And for whatever reason, one smell that often does that for people is the smell of fire. Maybe the smell of wood smoke or just the smell of an extinguished match. Lots of people really like those smells because it transports them. It's nostalgic. But for Peter, the smell of this fire was unbearable, because the smell of this fire was the smell of his lowest and greatest failure. The Greek word for charcoal fire is anthrakia. Anthrakia. And it appears twice in the Bible. Once here and once in John chapter 18, a few days prior to this in Jerusalem, shortly before Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus has just been arrested, and Peter is hovering anxiously in the high priest's courtyard. And let's get another slide up. I'll just read to you from those words in John 18. There's a servant girl there who recognizes Peter and asks him, "You aren't one of this man Jesus' disciples too, are you?" He replies, "I am not." It was cold, and the servant and officials stood round an anthrakia, a charcoal fire, that they'd made to warm themselves. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. And then the people standing around the fire ask Peter a second time. They say, "You aren't one of his disciples too, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." Then Peter is challenged a third time on the same point, this time by another servant, who says, "Didn't I see you with Jesus in the garden?" Again, Peter denied it. As Peter emerges from the waves onto the beach, the smell of that charcoal fire hit him, flooded him with memories of that evening. He was in that same place of fear, of shame, of guilt, of failure, all over again. But before Peter can really start feeling anything or feeling sorry for himself, Jesus tells him to help the others haul the net ashore. They've towed the net in the end, and now they're all hauling the net into the shore. Then Jesus invites them all to have breakfast around the fire. So we've had sensory overload, we've had fish overload. Now comes forgiveness overload. Around the charcoal fire in Jerusalem, Peter was asked 3 times, "Do you know Jesus?" And he said, "No, no, no." Now, gathered around a charcoal fire again, Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yes, yes, yes." Forgiveness overload. As many times as Peter let Jesus down, that's how many times Jesus gives him another chance to love him more. As many times as he let him down, that's how many times Jesus gave him a chance to love him more. If Peter had denied Jesus 4 times instead of 3, would Jesus have asked him 4 times, "Do you love me?" I think he would. The resurrection of Jesus was a moment of life overload. Jesus was God living a human life, and he was so full of life that when he met death just exploded. Jesus has defeated death and the powers of evil, and that includes all the evil and failure in Peter's life. So yes, I think Jesus would have forgiven Peter 4 times if necessary. His reserves are endless because the end, death, has been removed by him. And that's not just true for Peter, but it's true for us as well. Jesus is just as alive today as he was then with Peter. And his forgiveness overload, his endless reserves of forgiveness, are enough not just for him, but for you and for me. As many times as you fall short of Jesus' standard, as many times as you find yourself in one of life's lowest moments, that's how many times Jesus gives you another chance to love him more. He loves you so much that he won't stop giving you the opportunity to love him more, to love him back. He'll sit around that fire with you until the end of the age, if necessary. And this is the overload that baptism is really about. This is what is really going on when we pour water on people's heads or dunk them into pools with their clothes on. This is what's going on when people say yes to Jesus. It's what happened to Peter, and it's the start of a new life of forgiveness overload, a life that lives off the overload of God's life and God's love, that is Jesus. Now, normally, after about a week, or definitely after a month of hearing what I've just said, you and I probably would have forgotten everything that I've just said in the past 10 minutes. That's generally what happens with sermons. They're quite hard to remember in the long run. But not so today. Today, I've got a secret weapon. Today, I've got the power of smell on my side. Because from this day forth, whenever you smell a barbecue, you, like Peter, are going to remember the barbecue with Jesus on the beach. From now on, the smell of barbecue will remind you that however many times you walk away from Jesus, that's exactly how many times Jesus forgives you. That's exactly how many times Jesus gives you another chance to love him more. Now, I don't have a barbecue with me today to demonstrate. It wasn't allowed. But we do have the band. We've got Relu and Josie, who are on fire as well, in a good way, who are going to come up and lead us in a good old gospel song, a good old campfire song, Amazing Grace. I invite you to stand, and while we sing, I simply invite you to do one thing. So why don't we stand? I invite you to do one thing. In your imagination, put yourself in Peter's shoes. Smell the barbecue. Look at Jesus. Take a moment to bring your lowest low, your secret shame, or your deep worry or regret to Jesus. Tell him what it is. And let Jesus speak with you. Let him say your name, and let him ask you, do you love me? And just soak for a while. Feel the overload of grace and forgiveness that Peter felt that morning by the fire on the beach. That grace and that forgiveness is for him, and it's for each of us here this morning. Let's sing.